Welcome to SLP Nerdcast, your favorite professional resource for evidence-based practice in speech-language pathology. I'm Kate Granbois.
And I'm Amy Wonka. We are both speech-language pathologists working in the field and co-founders of SLP Nerdcast.
Each episode of this podcast is a course offered for ASHA CEUs. Our podcast audio courses are here to help you level up your knowledge and earn those professional development hours that you need. This course, plus the corresponding short post-test, is equal to 1 certificate of attendance. To earn CEUs today and take the post-test after this session, follow the link provided in the show notes or head to slpnerdcast.com.
Before we get started, one quick disclaimer. Our courses are not meant to replace clinical advice. We do not endorse products, procedures, or other services mentioned by our guests unless otherwise specified.
We hope you enjoy the course.
Are you an SLP or related professional? The SLP Nerdcast Unlimited subscription gives members access to over 100 courses offered for ASHA CEUs and certificates of attendance. With SLP Nerdcast membership, you can earn unlimited CEUs all year at any time. SLP Nerdcast courses are unique, evidence-based, with a focus on information that is useful. When you join SLP Nerdcast as a member, you'll have access to the best online platform for continuing education in speech and language pathology. Join as a member today and save 10% using code NERDCASTER10. The link for membership is in the show notes.
Welcome, everyone, to SLP Nerdcast. We are really excited for another edition of SLP On Demand. For those of you listening for the first time, SLP On Demand is a series that we put out occasionally where we answer questions from our audience. So if you are a member and you have a clinical question, you can write in, and our doctor of speech-language pathology, who is here with us today, Dr. Anna Paula Mumi, will answer your question. Welcome, Anna Paula.
Thank you.
I'm very excited for today's question. It touches something that I do for a living. I was really excited to kind of catch up with you before we hit the record button and learn a little bit more about what the research says, because that's always fun for me. Before we read our clinical question aloud, I am going to quickly review our learning objectives for today's discussion. Learning objective number 1, identify the relationship between data collection, target selection, and goal writing. And learning objective number 2, identify at least 2 different types of data collection that can be used when working with AAC users. Anyone who is listening can also find information about our financial and non-financial disclosures in the show notes. Anna Paula, why don't you get us started by reading aloud our listener's question?
Sure. So the question relates to resources for data collection for AAC users. And Andy, who wrote in, stated that her mentee has 14 life skills elementary students on her caseload, and she's looking for ways to help her efficiently track device use throughout her student's day.
So that's a really big question.
Yes. And I think we just have to first acknowledge, like, this is a big question that's hard to answer because there is so much that we don't know about these particular students. And there's also, we don't know specifics about what devices they're using. What does that look like? And so I would say just in general, this is going to be a little bit difficult to touch on, but also acknowledging that I would say data collection is tricky regardless, right? It's tricky whether we're working on articulation or language, or it doesn't really matter, right? All of these areas, especially tracking data or taking data without sacrificing genuine engagement with the person that's in front of you, right? So that's the big thing. I think I work a lot with grad students, and I think about how sometimes they're so attuned to the data collection process that they forget, like, oh, wait, but there's a person in front of me and I should be engaging, and just really building that relationship and the rapport. So I just wanted to acknowledge those setbacks in a sense, right, related to data collection.
And to kind of piggyback on that, obviously this episode is likely, it's under an hour long. We are not going to be able to cover everything about data collection in this short amount of time. Anyone who is listening who would like to learn more about data collection, either while you're listening to this episode or after this episode is over, we do have 3 or maybe even 4 episodes
Mhm.
specifically on monitoring progress and data collection, including probe data or discontinuous data, which I know we're going to talk a little bit about today. That is a very complex topic. So if you are listening and you know already that that's something that you'd want to learn more about, check out the show notes. We will put links to all of those episodes in the show notes for you.
Perfect. So I wanted to focus on one article in just my research and really just admitting, first of all, that I am not an expert on AAC. And so it's an area that is a stretch for me. And so as I looked through some of the research, I found one helpful article on data collection and monitoring AAC intervention in the schools by Katya Hill in 2009 in the Perspectives on AAC journal. And I appreciated how they talked about selecting the data to collect depending on the design and the targets of the intervention program. So in other words, really thinking about like, what are we actually tracking in relation to device use? And they divide up 2 areas or talk through 2 different areas, performance data and outcomes data. So with performance data, representing really the quantification of specific language targets. So things like spontaneous or novel utterances, communication rate, potentially, or any of the word-based measures that might include things like total number of words used, or maybe it's percentage of core vocabulary that's used, or mean length of utterance, even diversity of words. So is there a mixture, right, of are they using nouns, verbs, adjectives, and so on? So just looking at these word-based measures and other types of performance data. And then the other area was outcomes data, really representing the results of intervention that's related to things like quality of life and satisfaction and functionality. So that was helpful to me to categorize and make that distinction. And because our goal, and this is what they talk through, is to optimize communication in a student's daily environment, then we really should have both performance data that's collected in those environments and then also outcome measures that report, perceptions or satisfaction of performance by those closest to the student. So that could be teachers, of course, caregivers, but then of course the student, him or herself, right? And so I did wonder, Kate, if you would just touch on examples of the performance data that might be tied to or more appropriate for complex learners, because this might be easier for a child who is maybe more verbal, but not one that is where there's just more complex profile. So if you wanted to talk about that for a little bit, I would love to hear your
Sure.
input.
Sure. So, I mean, anyone who's listening to this podcast knows that, or has been listening for a while, that this is my jam. This is where my clinical wheelhouse. I'm very fortunate to have worked in AAC for the last almost 20 years now. Not quite 20 years, but over 15, not that we're counting. And this particular profile, complex learners, emergent learners, early language learners, is what I love to do. I really appreciate the way that you've described, at least from this article, these 2 different categories of data collection, because I think often when people think of data collection, they think of tally notes scribbled on a sticky, right? And going back to your point of not wanting to sacrifice connection, we grab what we have and we, oh gosh, I've got this goal on whatever it is, and so we scribble our tally notes and we think that that's our data collection. And yes, that is data collection. Is it quality data collection? Perhaps not. And I really just wanted to take a second to think, to at least appreciate the different qualifiers when it comes to the kind of data that you are collecting. That is a really important
Mhm.
first thought, to kind of zoom back to this learner's question or this member's question about what recommendations they can make to their mentor. And I think the first recommendation based on that article, from what I'm hearing from you, is really reflecting on your purpose. What are you taking data
Right.
about? Is it outcomes related? Is it performance related? Is it aligned with our EBP model in terms of considering clinicians' perspective, clients' perspectives and values? Um, I think when you keep that as a lens, it's a lot easier to then zoom in a little bit farther and think about what data collection methods are most appropriate to your next step or to the targets that you're trying to work towards. Now, I know that I just went really off topic, but to answer your question about an example for a complex learner or an emergent learner, um, I think that when you're, first of all, every child is unique. Every learner is unique. There is no, I have big feelings when I hear things like, well, this is the way it's done, or this is what we do here, or no, you are always customizing your AAC intervention to your learner, especially if that learner has a complex profile. So, a number one. You're always making data-driven decisions, person-driven decisions, patient-centered decisions, particularly when there is complexity involved. In a lot of when you're working with complex learners, often your first objectives are related to teaching symbolic exchange, teaching the use of symbolic language. Now, when I say symbolic exchange, I'm not talking about PECs. Before anybody gets a little grouchy thinking about PECs and all of the grouchy feelings that we've developed about PECs, we are talking about moving through a developmental lens to teach a person how to use symbols to communicate. And
Mhm.
I think, that can look like a lot of different things. That can, when you're talking about AAC, depending on your learner, that could look like selecting icons in a sequence. It could look like scanning a visual field to select an icon and make a purposeful choice.
Mhm.
It could look like sequencing two icons together to produce voice output. It could be producing one symbol for a function that isn't just requesting, or perhaps they are an emergent learner and they're in developmentally making requests and making basic wants and needs known is a main goal. So you want them to produce a single symbol to get their wants and needs met, and then everybody's throwing a party, right? So it
Mhm.
really will depend. So much on who the learner is in terms of choosing those targets and choosing that data collection strategy for performance. If anyone is listening wants to learn more about the lens of AAC and going back to basics, we did a great interview with Dr. Kathy Binger and Dr. Jennifer Kent Walsh called AAC Back to Basics that really specifically takes a good look at what the intersection of AAC and language development and how we
Mhm.
can better integrate those two things. Did I answer your question? I know I went on like four
Yes.
tangents.
No, you did, and
Okay,
thank
good.
you. That's perfect. I appreciate it. That makes it a lot clearer, and for sure, just having those tangible examples are super helpful. Another recommendation that I found in the initial stages of device use, which kind of goes back to a little bit of what you were saying, was to actually take data on what the SLP or the communication partner is doing. So there were some really helpful questions. Again, for me, because this is not my area, that helped me think through like, okay, so what does that mean exactly? So things like, how often does the student have access to their system throughout the day? That is a pretty important question, right? And then how many opportunities did the student have to actually use their device? Another question, how often are adults modeling on the device? And so that modeling component being huge, and maybe you could speak to that a little bit more.
I was going to say
Um,
I've got a great example for that, but keep going. I don't want to
yes.
interrupt you.
So I have one more here. How often is the student attending to the modeling that's provided? So again, this isn't necessarily looking at the output from the child. It's really more talking about the input, right? What is happening with the individuals around that child who are doing something or providing access or providing that modeling and so on. So yes, please give me examples.
I was going to say I was like jumping in my seat because I have such a great example for this. So backing up really quickly, back to our sticky note with tally marks on it, right? we think that is frequency data. So frequency data collection strategies would be, marking every single instance of the target behavior that happened. And again, we're not going to get into this in detail. We will list additional references or episodes in the show notes that unpacks a lot more of different kinds of strategies of data collection. Frequency is one of them. Percentage. Who doesn't love a good percentage? I think we over rely on them. Out of 80% of opportunities, right? Everybody knows how to take percentage data. And rate how many times you do things in a certain period of time. Those are all pretty common data collection strategies in speech pathology. One of the less common ones that I love, and I swear I'm going to answer your question, is trials to criterion. Trials to criterion is a data collection strategy where you're looking at the number of opportunities or the number of trials to criterion, that a person needs to achieve a certain threshold or to achieve a predetermined set of mastery. The reason that I love trials to criterion is because I have applied it to measuring the behavior of communication partners. And this is my story. I consult to a wide variety of programs in the Massachusetts area. Because I'm a BCBA, don't anybody hate me, I'm not evil. Because I'm a BCBA, I work a lot with behavioral programs. I work a lot with BCBAs and trying to integrate some of this speech pathology research, knowledge, best practice, person-centered care in some of these programs. And in that work, we have one program in particular, we did a lot of patient education, a lot of teacher education around the importance of modeling, around the importance of language bombardment, around the importance of making someone's program linguistically rich. And what we did was to kind of flip the script. We said, okay, how many trials does this one particular complex learner need to produce a word? How many models do they need? And what's nice about this is that we switch from asking the question, what does a student know, to how do they learn? Once you know how a complex student learns, rinse, repeat. You've got the recipe. Let's make all the cookies. Let's make all the words. Let's do this again and again and again. But when you really flip your thinking to thinking about asking questions and taking data to learn about how they learn instead of what they know, you can really apply that to the entire environment. So in this particular example, we took trials to criterion data on the number of models that were provided in a day. And to learn how many times did this one kiddo need to get exposed to this one word for them to be able to produce it? And the answer was hundreds. Wow. What's amazing is that he was able to get hundreds of exposures in a short period of time because the staff got super competitive. And they started becoming more aware of their own behavior and their own roles and responsibilities as communication partners. So another tangent, I guess that's my function and my role here today, is to go off on these tangents, but it's the different data collection strategies you choose can really help you shift the way you're thinking about where the quality data comes from, because it's not just your communication. It's not just your student. It's not just your client. You could be looking at data about the environment. You could be looking at data about the communication partners. We're really talking about a whole human and a whole microcosm, a whole environment, a whole set of variables that we need to consider for AAC success. I hope I answered your question again.
Yes, thank you. One more thing that I wanted to touch on before I'm going to pose another question to you, Kate, is I found just a variety of data collection sheets that were downloadable for free. And again, for me, it was helpful just to think through like how are they structured and, just in different ways and organized. And so there were some that were goal-based versus prompt-based data collection. And so one example was data collection that was based on modeled words. So you select a word and then show, of course, the child, what happens when you select that word. And so having that sequence of modeling and then seeing or giving them a taste of what does that produce, right? Or what's the outcome after that happens. And then it was also a word selected by the child after a prompt was provided, and then a word selected spontaneously by the child without any prompting. So they had essentially like an MPS format where you were tracking modeled words that were prompted, and then words that were spontaneous. So MPS was one way that it was structured. Another example was based on a variety of language functions like requesting, protesting, are they commenting, describing, negotiating, and so on. So there was lots of different options to think through, because I feel like so often we get stuck on just requesting, right? It's just a request button. And that's like the only thing that counts or that really is being monitored, when there's so much more, right, that we can look for when it comes to language usage, beyond just number of words. So those were really helpful for me to look through, just in terms of thinking about, efficiently tracking usage with different parameters. Do you have anything to add in relation to that?
I think, everybody wants a good data sheet. Data sheets are better than your sticky note with scratch with tally marks. I think something that you bring up that's really important to think about is the relationship between data collection and goal writing. This is a whole episode that we can link that we've done on the importance of measurement, target selection. We will link that in the show notes as well. The short Cliff's Notes version is, we think of data collection and goal writing as something that happens in a sequence. So first we write our goal, then we take our data. And that's absolutely not the case. We need to be thinking these are two things that happen in tandem. They influence one another. We want to be thinking, before we write our goal, we want to be thinking about what's the data collection going to look like? Is it reasonable? Is it doable? Who's collecting the data? How often is it going to get collected? You also want to think about your target when you're writing your goal and how your target's going to get measured. Is it a target skill that's really fleeting and you have to be watching the entire time? Is it a target skill that is prolonged? Is it something that's low frequency, so you're going to be lucky if it happens once a day? Or is it high frequency where it's potentially happening multiple times in a half hour? All of these things are really important to consider when you are thinking about your data collection. And when it comes to recording your data, there are a lot of different ways in AAC to do that. I think the best way is the one that works for you, that keeps your hands free, that keeps your attention on your client. There are two strategies that I think there are a handful that I think could be considered, that I think are worth considering. The first is maybe a tally counter or a golf counter. I don't know why it's called a golf counter, but they're like little they're like bouncers. You see them at the clubs, clicking for capacity in a bar or whatever. Those are nice to kind of hang on your belt. With a carabiner, you could do one on each side. If you're doing percentage data, your right side is for successful trials, your left side is for unsuccessful trials. At the end of the session, you've got a total percentage. You didn't have to do any sticky notes. Another consideration would be probe data. So probe data is really complex. We have a whole episode on probe data. The short version of the story is that any data collection system that you want your data collection to be accurate, reliable, and valid. If you are not measuring accurately, then you're not going to be able to inform your goals and you're not going to be able to measure progress. It's impossible to, in a lot of instances, track every single instance of an occurrence. That is when you get into this trouble of not being able to engage with your client and have a nice connected session. A potential answer to this problem is probe data, where you're only recording a predetermined set of a certain number of trials. The problem with probe data is that it can be really inaccurate. It can violate that, ideal standard of data collection that's accurate, reliable, and valid. The way to mitigate and take probe data in a way that is better is to take the more probes you take, the more accurate. And if you add a qualifier to that, so let's say you're recording the first 3 trials, but you're also recording whether or not it was prompted. You're also recording how long the duration. You're adding some qualifier onto the probe. The more probes you take and the more qualifiers you add, the more accurate it is. And again, we have an entire hour-long episode that reviews the research. Not that it's very dry. I know it sounds boring, but we really liked it. So there are a lot of different ways that you can make your probe data more accurate, reliable, and valid. I think another problem with AAC in particular with data collection is that it feels cumbersome because you've got this extra device. So you're like, but I got the device and I've got the student and now I have these golf counters and a pen and a sticky note and there's all these things. It can feel really overwhelming. And I think there is often in a lot of instances a big temptation to use the internal tracking system. So a lot of our devices come with internal data collection trackers where you can toggle it on and it will record every instance of a target behavior or every instance of a target communications or every instance of an icon selection rather. Those are really tempting, but they have a lot of limitations. So the first major limitation is ethics. We have heard from the AAC community that these mechanisms feel very much like spying. Imagine if there was someone walking around with you all day, following you around, listening to every single thing you said, but didn't tell you that they were listening. We need to be, if we're going to use these mechanisms, we need to be extremely careful about turning them on and off and doing it with informed consent. And that's informed consent for the AAC user and potentially their families, depending on their age and all of these other kinds of things. The other thing that we really need to think about with these internal data collection systems is the law. So we could, depending on your state, there is a potential that you are violating a privacy law by taking this data and storing it in a cloud that is not part of your district. It could be a violation of FAPE. Here in Massachusetts, we have to be very careful about that, and we have families sign additional permissions. Some schools and some programs I work with won't even do it because it is too close to some violation. So check with your administrators, check with your state, and make sure that use of these is even within the provision of what would be considered secure storage of data as part of an educational file. So that's another consideration there. The other and last limitation of these internal tracking systems is that they are going to track everything. These little tiny robots inside these machines don't know if it's you that selected the button or the child or the student that selected the button. So if you are using them for short periods of time, because we know we have to turn them off so that we're not theoretically, following someone around listening to what they say all day. While it is on, you want to make sure that you're only capturing what it is that you're measuring. So if you're capturing models for a communication partner, you want to make sure that the student doesn't select a device, doesn't select an icon. Or conversely, if you're using it to measure independent student productions, you have to make sure you're not providing any prompting, that you're not providing any modeling on the device, that the tally mark that you're getting is actually independent productions of the student. So there are a lot of limitations to those, and those are all really important things to consider.
Absolutely. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that for sure. And it really, I think in some ways that almost defeats the purpose of the therapy strategy of modeling, right? So if your goal is to model a ton and to really see that growth through modeling, then you almost would be shooting yourself in the foot if you used it, right? Like,
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I want to just ask a follow-up question to just in relation to the goal writing. So you kind of already answered the initial question that I had. So I'm just going to add on to the question, just because, again, thinking about our member who is mentoring someone and really just understanding that relationship between goal writing and data collection, how might she help her mentee with goal writing to help with better data collection? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think, again, this is a really great question. And like you said at the beginning of the episode, to really answer this question well, we need a lot more information, right? Because we don't know if this individual is a complex learner. We don't know what their goals are. And the goals and targets are going to have a significant impact on how progress is monitored. Because again, data collection and goal writing are BFFs. They cannot be separated. You cannot do one without the other. They don't happen in a sequence. They happen in tandem, and they influence each other continually. Because as you're monitoring progress, theoretically, if they're making progress, the goal may need to be adjusted, right? That's why we have annual IEP meetings, because we're rewriting goals based on progress. I think when you're working with a mentee and you're trying to unpack some of these concepts, I would go back to the goal first, and I would go back to the target and think about what it is that you're measuring and all of the variables that will influence how that measurement is taken. Um, that might include all of things that we've already mentioned, but the environment, the communication partners, how fleeting the communication target is. And I also think it's important to have a little bit of forward thinking. And I know this is a question about a school environment. So theoretically, you have an entire year under the IEP to take that data collection. But having a really good baseline measurement is also really important because if
Mhm.
you don't know where you started, how do you know where you're going? And for some particularly complex learners, really small steps are really huge deals, and we don't want to miss
Right.
them. We don't want to not give credit where it's due for our students who are working so hard, and the paraprofessionals who are working so hard, and the teachers who are working so hard, and the whole team who
Mhm.
is working so hard, right? So, taking those, I would also be really asking a lot of questions about where the student is currently and taking really good baseline measurement so that you have a strong foundation off of which to judge what progress was made to begin with. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
So do you want to talk a little bit? Do we have time to just touch on, um, do you have like favorite ways to measure baseline or recommendations or strategies that you like your go-to options, for baseline? Or is
That's a
that
really it's a
another?
really good question. I think not as a standard because it is going to be influenced so much by the learner and the
Sure.
environment. I think in a perfect universe, we would take enough baseline measurement to have a solid understanding that this is exactly where the student is and not just a bad day. Particularly
Hmm.
for more complex learners who might be, presenting with sleep disturbances, or, there might be other things going on in the child's life that make that one day that you took baseline measurement not the best day for baseline measurement. So in a perfect world, we would
Right.
have a decent amount of measurement at the beginning of treatment to have a good understanding of where we are so we can decide where we're going. Um, I also think that designing data collection systems that feel achievable and doable is really
Hmm.
important because if it's not achievable and doable, then the data that you collect is going to be inaccurate. In one of our data collection courses, we talk about this a little bit more depth, but there is an expression garbage in, garbage out. So if
Hmm.
your data collection is inaccurate, that's going to inform your progress in an inaccurate way, which is going to lead to inaccurate decision making and clinical reflection, and potentially poor choices for implementation and intervention. So,
Hmm.
really making sure that we hold data collection strategies that are accurate, reliable, and valid at the center is really, really important. And there's really no gold standard because it's such a customized experience.
Sure.
We have a handout on our website that I will include in the show notes as well on what accurate, reliable, and valid data means. And again, referring people back to our original, some of our previous work in data collection, just because I recognize that this is a very nuanced, a very nuanced conversation.
Yes. Well, and just, one takeaway for me, just as you were talking, is to really think about representative samples, right? And when we think about this, whether it's a speech sample for an ARTIC kid or a language sample for a child with a developmental delay, I mean, it doesn't matter what the situation is, we have to make sure that we are doing what we can to make sure that we are sampling um, their speech, their device usage, whatever, in the best way possible, but also yielding the most representative sample possible. And so it might take more than one trial, right, to get there. Because, like you said, there's so many variables that could impact that individual's willingness to participate or willingness to show what they do know or what they are capable of doing. So yeah, that's important. I think sometimes, with AAC, we tend to maybe think differently, or we don't use sometimes like just the basic knowledge that we already have about like, yeah, in the same way that this applies to XYZ, it's going to also apply for our AAC users. There's maybe, like you said, nuances or different things that we have to take into consideration, but it's still, there's some basics that are just foundational, right?
Yep. Totally agree. Totally agree. So, I mean, I think I really appreciate the literature that you brought to the table. I know I shared quite a bit, but I couldn't help myself because this is my area. This is my clinical area.
And I love
Um,
learning from you.
and
So
it's so
this is
great.
wonderful.
It's so great. We will link all of the additional resources in the show notes. Anna Paula, was there anything else that you wanted to share?
No, that's it. That's all I had for today.
And to the listener who wrote in this question, thank you so much for writing in. We hope we did it justice on, in terms of what you shared. Anyone out there who's listening, if you have a question for us and you're a member, please write in. We would love to read your questions and do a little literature search for you and discuss your clinical case on the air. Dr. Anna Paula Mumi, thank you so much for being here. This was really wonderful. And we look forward to the next iteration of SLPD On Demand.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us in today's episode. As always, you can use this episode for ASHA CEUs. You can also potentially use this episode for other credits depending on the regulations of your governing body. To determine if this episode will count towards professional development in your area of study, please check in with your governing bodies, or you can go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. All of the references and information listed throughout the course of the episode will be listed in the show notes. And as always, if you have any questions, please email us at info@slpnerdcast.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to welcome you back here again soon.